"You should have signed the house over to us years ago," my daughter-in-law whispered at my husband's funeral reception, thinking I couldn't hear her. I said nothing. I just folded my hands in my lap and kept smiling while the guests around us sipped coffee from delicate paper cups and pretended not to notice the tension hanging in the room like thick winter fog. My name is Hannah Whitmore. I'm 68 years old, and until 3 weeks ago, I believed I had the perfect family. My husband Richard and I spent 42 years building a life together in a quiet Connecticut town where people still waved at their neighbors and decorated their front porches for every season. We raised one son, Daniel, in the white colonial house at the end of Maple Lane. The same house where I learned how to bake peach cobbler from Richard's mother. The same house where Daniel took his first steps across the hardwood floors while Richard cheered from the kitchen doorway. Every Christmas morning, every Thanksgiving dinner, every birthday candle had happened inside those walls. I used to think that meant something. I used to think memories protected a family from falling apart. But grief has a strange way of peeling people open. It reveals who they really are underneath the polite smiles and family photographs. Richard died on a rainy Tuesday morning after suffering a sudden heart attack while trimming the hedges in our backyard. One moment he was humming Sinatra songs under his breath, and the next, my world was gone. For days after the funeral, casseroles arrived at the front door from neighbors. Sympathy cards stacked across the dining room table. People hugged me tightly and told me Richard had been a good man. And he was. He truly was. But after the flowers started wilting and the visitors stopped coming, something shifted inside the house. Daniel stopped lingering after dinner. He barely looked me in the eyes anymore. And my daughter-in-law, Vanessa, suddenly acted as if she belonged there more than I did. She walked through my kitchen opening cabinets without asking. She criticized the wallpaper Richard had picked out 20 years ago. She even suggested converting our bedroom into a home office because natural light increases productivity. At first, I blamed grief. Everyone mourns differently, I told myself. Daniel was hurting too. But then little things started happening. Strange things. One afternoon, I came home from the grocery store and found Vanessa sitting at my dining room table surrounded by folders and paperwork. She quickly closed everything when she saw me. "Just organizing financial documents," she said with a bright smile that never quite reached her eyes. Another time, I noticed my late husband's study had been cleaned out without anyone asking me. His favorite fountain pen was gone. So were several file boxes he kept locked in the closet for years. Daniel thought it was time to simplify things. Vanessa explained casually while scrolling through her phone. Simplify things. As if a man's entire life could be reduced to clutter. The worst part wasn't her behavior. It was Daniel's silence. My son used to call me every Sunday morning just to ask how I was doing. He used to bring me tulips from the farmer's market because he remembered they were my favorite flower. But now, whenever Vanessa spoke, he nodded like a tired employee agreeing with his manager during a meeting he wanted to end quickly. One cold November evening, they invited me to dinner. Vanessa cooked lemon herb chicken and lit expensive candles that smelled like pine trees. Everything looked beautiful on the surface. Perfect, even. But some silences feel dangerous. Some smiles feel rehearsed. Halfway through dessert, Vanessa casually asked if I had considered downsizing. I stared at her over my coffee cup while snow drifted softly outside the windows. "This house is a lot for one person," she continued carefully. "The maintenance alone must be exhausting." Daniel kept staring down at his plate. My chest tightened slowly. "I've managed this home for over 40 years, I replied softly. Vanessa smiled again. Calm, polished, patient. Of course. But maybe it's time to think practically. Practically. Such a harmless word. Such a cruel one, too. That night, I barely slept. I walked through the quiet hallways of my home, touching framed family photographs with trembling fingers. Daniel at age 10 holding a baseball trophy. Richard grilling hamburgers during the 4th of July. Me standing between them both one summer at Cape Cod with wind blowing through my hair. We looked so happy. That was the painful part. None of it had been fake. The love was real once. Which meant the betrayal was real too. The next morning, I opened the mailbox and found an envelope from our bank. I almost ignored it. Richard had always handled most of the financial paperwork. But something about the official seal made my stomach twist. I carried it into the kitchen, sat beside the same window where Richard used to drink his morning coffee, and slowly opened it. Inside was a notice regarding a pending transfer request connected to the deed of my house. My hands froze instantly. Beneath the legal language was a name I recognized immediately. Vanessa Whitmore. The envelope felt heavier than any letter I had ever received. I did not open it immediately. I carried it to the living room and set it carefully on the mahogany coffee table, its polished surface reflecting the muted sunlight that filtered through the curtains. I sat down in my favorite armchair, the one Richard always said made him feel like he could read my thoughts just by looking at me. I traced my fingers over the edge of the envelope, feeling the embossed seal beneath my fingertips. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of the wall clock and the occasional whisper of wind through the maple trees outside. My heart raced, but I remained still, breathing slowly, letting the world continue around me as though nothing had changed. I remembered the mornings when Daniel would run down the stairs with his socks sliding across the hardwood, his laughter echoing through the halls, and the smell of Richard brewing coffee in the kitchen mingling with the warm scent of toast. Those mornings felt like a different life now. Carefully, I broke the seal and unfolded the document. My eyes scanned the formal text, the legal terminology precise and cold. My son and daughter-in-law had submitted a request to transfer the house deed to their names. Each word hit me with quiet force, like the sudden chill of winter entering through an open window. I sat back and let the document rest in my lap, feeling the weight of what this meant. This was more than a property dispute. This was the culmination of months of subtle manipulation, the culmination of a shift I had sensed but had not fully acknowledged. I thought of the small changes, the rearranged furniture, the whispered conversations I caught at the kitchen counter, the way Daniel no longer offered to help with grocery trips or household chores. It was as if a wall had slowly risen between us, brick by brick, until I was no longer seen as the matriarch of this family, but merely a resident in my own home. I looked around the living room. The photographs on the walls seemed different somehow. The picture of Daniel and me at his high school graduation felt distant, a captured moment of happiness that no longer belonged to the present. The fireplace mantel held our family portraits, but the smile seemed forced, almost mocking. I closed my eyes and allowed myself a moment to breathe, to feel the quiet anger simmering beneath my calm exterior. I recalled the Thanksgiving dinner just a month ago, when Vanessa had taken over the kitchen, rearranging the table settings and instructing me on where to place each dish. I had smiled politely, nodding and pretending to follow her suggestions, but inside, I was cataloging every word, every gesture, every decision that demonstrated her control over what had once been our family traditions. Even then, a part of me had known something was wrong. There had been a subtle shift in Daniel's demeanor as well. The way he nodded to her guidance without question, the way his eyes rarely met mine, the way he deferred to her opinions as though my presence was no longer relevant. That night, I did not speak to anyone. I placed the document in my study drawer, behind the lock Richard had installed years ago for his personal files. I walked through the house, room by room, touching objects I had restored, paintings I had hung, chairs I had polished, remembering the care I had poured into making this house a home. Each touch reinforced the realization that the home I had built with love was being claimed as something else, something foreign. I poured a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the gray November sky, the bare branches swaying in the breeze. I allowed myself to acknowledge the disappointment, the quiet ache of betrayal, but I did not allow it to control me. In those moments of stillness, I began to form a plan, a subtle strategy to address the injustice without confrontation, to reclaim my authority and protect the legacy Richard and I had built. I considered my options carefully, weighing every step, understanding that patience and observation were my allies. I would not act out of anger. I would act with precision. My mind traced through potential conversations with Daniel, ways to involve the bank, legal counsel, and any other measures that ensured clarity and fairness. I looked at my reflection in the window glass, seeing my silver hair, the lines on my face, the steady hands that had prepared countless meals and tended countless arguments, the hands that had held Daniel when he was sick, the hands that had comforted Richard through worry and grief. These were the hands that would navigate this new reality with measured determination. The tea had cooled, but I did not mind. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves, a reminder that time moved on whether one was ready or not. I took a deep breath, letting the house absorb the quiet tension, knowing that in this stillness I was gathering strength. I understood that what had happened was deliberate, that Vanessa's influence had grown insidiously, but I also knew that perception could be managed and patience could reveal truth. I would watch, I would record, I would prepare. And when the time was right, I would act in a way that left no room for doubt, asserting my place, protecting the home, and preserving the dignity of a life built with love and care. The morning light filtered through the tall living room windows, casting a soft glow over the furniture that had witnessed decades of laughter and quiet conversations. I poured a fresh cup of chamomile tea, the warmth seeping through my fingers as I settled into the armchair facing the front door. Outside, the maple leaves danced in the November breeze, and I allowed myself a brief moment of calm before the day began. Daniel had left early for work, a terse goodbye that felt more like an acknowledgement of obligation than love, and Vanessa was upstairs, arranging what she called a strategic organizational plan for the house. The calm was deceptive. I knew every move she made had intent, a subtle recalibration of control. I thought back to last week, the time I had discovered small discrepancies in the household accounts, checks missing or redirected, bills unexpectedly paid. I did not confront her then. Instead, I observed, noted, and began connecting dots that had been scattered for months. Each instance, seemingly trivial at the time, now formed a pattern of careful manipulation. I remembered the Thanksgiving dinner, the way she had positioned herself at the head of the table, guiding conversations, subtly minimizing my presence, while complimenting Daniel on decisions he had made under her influence. The candles flickered softly on the polished oak table, casting shadows that mimicked the tension I felt simmering beneath the surface. I sipped my tea slowly, allowing each swallow to ground me. My thoughts wandered back to the kitchen, where I had spent countless hours preparing meals for this family, each recipe chosen with care, each dish crafted with love. Now, those same spaces were orchestrated by Vanessa, who navigated them with the air of someone claiming territory she had no right to own. I recalled the subtle shift in Daniel as well, his responses muted, his eyes downcast when I spoke, as though he had been trained to defer, to prioritize her wishes over our family traditions. I remembered the small things, the rearranged chairs, the replaced doorknobs, the quiet redirection of family activities, all under the guise of efficiency or modern sensibility. Each act, though outwardly polite, chipped away at the foundation of familiarity, a calculated erosion of the home Richard and I had built. I took a slow breath and allowed my mind to move beyond frustration into strategy. Observation, I reminded myself, was a powerful tool. I made mental notes of her habits, her timing, the subtle ways she engaged Daniel in private conversations. These details would become the framework for understanding the scope of her influence. I walked slowly through the house, touching the surfaces of shelves and counters that held traces of a life carefully curated. The photographs of family milestones, the awards and mementos, each item anchored me to the reality of what had been accomplished through decades of dedication and care. In the quiet of the study, I opened Richard's journal, his meticulous handwriting a reminder of his foresight and values. I read passages about our family, the lessons he hoped to impart, and the importance of integrity and mutual respect. These words strengthened my resolve. I could not allow the subtle manipulations of a single person to rewrite the story of a life spent nurturing love and stability. The tea had long gone cold, but I barely noticed. I sat there for a moment longer, letting the silence envelop me, using it to sharpen my focus and clarify the path ahead. I understood now that patience, careful observation, and strategic action would be more effective than confrontation. The house was mine in essence, if not in legal documents, and I would ensure that the legacy Richard and I built would not be overshadowed by deception. I looked out the window, watching the leaves shift and spin, and I made a silent promise to myself. I would move forward with dignity, intelligence, and quiet strength, and I would not be caught unaware again. The afternoon sunlight spilled across the living room floor, highlighting the gentle imperfections of the hardwood that had been polished over decades. I stood by the window with a cup of tea warming my hands, watching the shadows stretch and fold across the furniture, each piece a witness to a lifetime of family gatherings, laughter, and quiet conversations. The quiet was deep, yet it carried the weight of months of subtle tension. Vanessa was upstairs. Her presence felt more than seen, as she moved through the house with precise, measured steps that seemed to command the space she occupied. Daniel had gone to work early again, leaving the house in its fragile calm. I moved through the kitchen, tracing the counter edges with my fingertips, remembering the meals I had prepared for holidays and Sunday dinners. The way the aroma of roasted chicken or apple pie had once drawn Daniel and Richard from other rooms to the table. Each scent carried memory, each corner a fragment of history. I paused by the spice rack, noting a few bottles had been shifted, a small but deliberate change that did not escape my notice. It was in these small alterations, the subtle rearrangements of familiar objects, that the extent of her influence became clear. The house, once a sanctuary of comfort and warmth, now carried an unfamiliar air, an undercurrent of calculated control. I walked to the living room and sat in the armchair near the fireplace, my hands folding over the tea mug, letting the warmth seep into my skin and calm the rising tension. Outside, the maple trees bent lightly in the breeze, their golden leaves whispering against the window pane. I allowed myself to think back, to recollect moments that seemed innocuous at the time, but now revealed themselves as part of a larger pattern. Vanessa's comments during the holidays, the way she redirected Daniel's attention, her suggestions about the household, all seemed trivial in isolation, but together they painted a picture of careful planning, of influence gradually extending over the life of our family. I recalled the summer afternoons when Daniel would bring friends over, Richard would be in the yard tending to the garden, and I would arrange the lemonade and cookies. Vanessa's absence at these times had always seemed normal. Now, in retrospect, her absence was part of the design, a space being prepared for her eventual assertion of control. I sipped my tea and let my thoughts flow to the legal documents, the deed that had been submitted for transfer. It was a cold, factual reminder that action was required. That observation alone would not secure the home or the legacy Richard and I had built. Yet there was strength in knowing the details, in having cataloged every gesture, every choice, every moment that had contributed to this current situation. Patience was a strategy as much as it was a shield. I moved through the rooms, touching the objects that held memory, the frames with photographs of family vacations, the trophies Daniel had won in school, the cards from birthdays past. Each item reinforced a sense of continuity, of history that could not be erased by a single person's ambition. I sat again by the window, the tea now cooling in the mug. I breathed in slowly, letting the quiet house carry me into clarity. Decisions would need to be made, conversations held, but first understanding was required. I began to map the patterns in my mind, the moments when influence had shifted, the subtle cues from Daniel, the precision of Vanessa's timing. Each observation added to a mosaic, a picture that would inform every step forward. There was no rush, only the deliberate preparation of a response that would restore order, respect, and balance. I felt a quiet determination, a steady resolve to navigate the next days with careful attention, preserving dignity, protecting the home, and honoring the life Richard and I had built together. The sunlight shifted, casting new angles and deepening shadows, and I remained there, poised and ready, knowing that the true measure of strength lay not in reaction, but in composed, thoughtful action. 2 days later, the first crack in Vanessa's perfect composure appeared in the most unexpected way. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon, cold enough that the windows fogged slightly from the warmth inside the house. I had just finished folding laundry in the upstairs hallway when I heard the front door open downstairs, followed by hurried footsteps crossing the foyer. Vanessa rarely came home before Daniel, so I paused beside the staircase, listening carefully. Her heels clicked rapidly against the hardwood floor, sharp and uneven, nothing like her usual controlled pace. Then I heard another voice. Soft, nervous, female. I really do not think this is a good idea anymore, the woman whispered. I moved slowly toward the staircase, keeping my hand against the railing as I listened. You are overreacting, Vanessa replied quickly. Everything is already in motion. By the time she figures it out, it will be too late. My chest tightened, but my face remained calm. I recognized the second voice a moment later. It belonged to Emily, my 24-year-old granddaughter, Daniel's daughter from his first marriage. Emily had always been different from the rest of the family. Quiet, observant, the kind of young woman who noticed things other people ignored. As a little girl, she used to sit beside me in the garden for hours asking questions about flowers, recipes, and family stories. Even after college, she still called me every Sunday evening just to check on me. She trusted all of us, Emily said softly downstairs. Grandpa would not have wanted this. There was a long silence after that sentence. The kind of silence that reveals more than words ever could. I carefully stepped back from the staircase before they could notice me listening. A few moments later, I heard the front door close again. Only one set of footsteps remained inside the house. Vanessa moved toward the kitchen, opening drawers and cabinets with restless energy. I waited several minutes before walking downstairs slowly, pretending I had heard nothing. She looked up immediately when I entered the kitchen. Her smile appeared too quickly. "You are home early," I said gently. "Just organizing paperwork," she replied while shuffling a stack of folders near the counter. "Daniel asked me to help streamline some financial things." Streamline. Another harmless word that suddenly sounded dangerous. I nodded politely and walked toward the coffee maker. The smell of hazelnut coffee filled the kitchen while Vanessa continued pretending to organize papers she clearly did not want me to see. But something had shifted now. Emily knew something. More importantly, Emily was uncomfortable. That mattered deeply. Later that evening, after Vanessa left to meet friends for dinner, my phone rang. Emily's name appeared across the screen. I answered quietly. "Hi, sweetheart." There was hesitation on the other end before she finally spoke. "Grandma, are you okay?" Such a small question. Yet it nearly broke my heart because of how carefully she asked it. I glanced toward the dark kitchen where Richard used to sit reading the newspaper after dinner. "I have had better weeks," I admitted softly. Emily exhaled slowly, as though she had been carrying tension for days. "I think you need to be careful," she whispered. I sat straighter immediately. "What do you mean?" Another pause followed. "I found some documents at Dad's office last week. Vanessa has been meeting with a real estate attorney for over 2 months. My fingers tightened around the phone. 2 months. "Yes," Emily replied quietly. Before Grandpa even passed away, the room suddenly felt colder. I stared at the family photographs lining the hallway wall while her words settled into place like pieces of shattered glass. Before Richard died, before the funeral, before sympathy cards and casseroles and whispered condolences, Vanessa had already been planning. "Dad does not know everything," Emily continued carefully. "I truly believe she has been controlling most of this." I closed my eyes briefly. Somehow, hearing that hurt more than I expected, because part of me still wanted to believe Daniel was simply grieving. Confused. Weak. Not cruel. Emily lowered her voice even further. "Grandma, she is trying to convince him to sell the house by spring." Silence filled the space between us. Outside, wind rattled the bare tree branches against the windows. I could almost hear Richard's voice in the back of my mind reminding me to stay calm, to think clearly before reacting. "Thank you for telling me," I finally said. "I did not know who else to talk to," Emily whispered. "Something about this feels wrong." I swallowed carefully, keeping my voice steady despite the ache building in my chest. "You did the right thing." After we hung up, I remained seated in the dark living room for a long time. The grandfather clock ticked softly near the staircase. The house felt heavy with memory and quiet betrayal. But beneath the sadness, something else began forming inside me. Clarity. Vanessa believed she was orchestrating everything perfectly. She believed grief had made me weak, distracted, incapable of noticing what was happening around me. But she had made one mistake. She underestimated how carefully a woman watches the people she loves when she senses her family slipping away. The next morning, I woke before sunrise to the familiar creaking sound of the heating system pushing warm air through the old vents. For a moment, lying there beneath the heavy quilt Richard and I had bought during our trip to Vermont years ago, I almost forgot everything. The silence felt ordinary, peaceful even. But then reality settled back over me like cold rain. I sat up slowly and glanced toward Richard's side of the bed. His reading glasses still rested on the nightstand exactly where he had left them the evening before he died. I had not moved them. Somehow, leaving them there made the room feel less empty. Downstairs, I brewed coffee and stood by the kitchen window while the sky shifted from gray to pale blue. Frost covered the backyard grass in delicate white patterns. The maple trees stood bare now, their branches thin and dark against the morning light. I used to love this season. Richard always called late autumn the honest season because everything hidden during summer finally revealed itself. The dying leaves, the empty branches, the quiet earth preparing for winter. I finally understood what he meant. By 9 o'clock, Vanessa came downstairs dressed in cream-colored slacks and a fitted sweater that looked far too elegant for a simple morning at home. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup soft and polished. She smiled when she saw me standing at the counter. "You are up early," she said lightly while reaching for a coffee mug. "Could not sleep," I replied calmly. She nodded sympathetically, though the expression looked practiced rather than sincere. Grief affects everyone differently. I watched her carefully as she added almond milk to her coffee and checked messages on her phone. There was confidence in her movements now. Confidence built from believing she was already winning. "Daniel and I are meeting with a realtor later this afternoon," she said casually without looking up from the screen. "Just exploring options for the future." There it was. Not hidden anymore. Not whispered behind closed doors. Open. Deliberate. I took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "That seems fast." She finally looked at me then. Her expression measured. "The market is strong right now. We would be foolish not to consider opportunities." Opportunities. Another harmless word carrying sharp edges beneath it. I set my cup down carefully. This house is not simply an opportunity. Her smile tightened slightly. Of course not. It is family property. Family property. Not my home. Not the place where I spent 42 years building a life with Richard. Just property. A financial asset waiting to be converted into profit. Before I could respond, the front door opened and Daniel stepped inside unexpectedly. He looked tired, distracted, his tie loosened slightly as if he had already lived through an exhausting day before noon. "Morning," he muttered quietly. Vanessa immediately shifted her attention toward him, her entire posture softening. "I thought you had meetings all morning." "Cancelled," he replied while rubbing his forehead. I noticed dark circles beneath his eyes. Guilt leaves traces if you know where to look. Vanessa walked over and touched his arm gently. "Do not forget the appointment at 2. Daniel hesitated. "Just briefly." "But I saw it." "Right," he answered quietly. The room fell silent after that. Thick. Uncomfortable. I picked up my coffee cup and moved toward the sink. "Emily called me last night," I said calmly. Both of them froze. It lasted less than a second, but it was enough. Vanessa recovered first. "Oh," she asked carefully. "How is she doing?" "Concerned," I replied softly while rinsing the cup beneath warm water. Daniel shifted uncomfortably near the kitchen island. "Concerned about what?" he asked. I turned slowly and looked directly at my son for the first time in weeks. Really looked at him. At the exhaustion in his eyes. The uncertainty hiding beneath his silence. "Families change after loss," I answered quietly. "Sometimes people make decisions too quickly." Vanessa crossed her arms lightly. Defensive. Controlled. "Nobody is trying to hurt you, Hannah." Hurt. Interesting choice of words. Because I had never accused them of hurting me. Not out loud. Yet somehow she already felt accused. "I hope that is true," I said gently. Another silence followed. Outside, wind brushed softly against the windows while the old grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hallway. Tick, 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 like a countdown quietly unfolding beneath the surface of our lives. Daniel finally looked away first. Vanessa reached for her purse a few moments later and announced she needed to leave early for errands. Her voice remained smooth, but I noticed how quickly she moved toward the door. Pressure changes people, especially when they realize they are no longer completely in control. After she left, Daniel lingered near the kitchen counter without speaking. I continued wiping dishes slowly, giving him space to say whatever had been building inside him. Finally, he sighed heavily. "Mom," his voice cracked slightly on the word. Just enough for me to hear the little boy he used to be underneath the grown man standing in my kitchen. "I know things have been difficult lately." Difficult. Such a small word for betrayal. I dried my hands carefully before turning toward him. "Do you know what your father loved most about this house?" Daniel looked confused by the question. "What?" I smiled faintly. "Not the size. Not the value. Not the location." I glanced around the kitchen softly. He loved that it felt safe. Daniel lowered his eyes immediately, and in that moment, I realized something important. Vanessa may have controlled the plan, but my son was beginning to realize the cost of following her. That evening, I walked slowly through the hallway toward the study, the soft creak of the floorboards under my feet punctuating the quiet house. The The sky outside was fading to a deep indigo, and the first stars began to appear above the maple trees in the backyard. I paused at each photograph lining the wall, remembering birthdays, graduations, and ordinary Sundays spent together. Each memory was a layer of history, carefully stacked, showing the life Richard and I had built, a life now shadowed by deception. I reached the study and ran my fingers over the spines of old ledgers and journals, pausing on Richard's handwriting, neat and deliberate, chronicling not only finances but the moments he treasured most. The house smelled faintly of old wood and the lingering aroma of the dinner I had prepared earlier, lemon herb chicken cooling on the counter. I thought of Emily's words from yesterday, her quiet warning, her concern, and I realized she was an unexpected ally, a bridge back to clarity. I opened one of Richard's journals, tracing the familiar loops of his letters, reading passages about family integrity, the importance of honesty, and the care required to maintain trust. I let the words settle, absorbing the weight of decades of insight. Later, Daniel returned from work, the evening light casting long shadows through the windows. He appeared unsettled, the tension in his shoulders betraying a mind racing with questions he had not voiced. I remained in the study, moving slowly between shelves, careful not to provoke confrontation, letting him see only the composed presence of someone grounded and observant. "Mom," he said after a long pause, his voice low, almost cautious, "I spoke with Emily today." I nodded without turning. "She told you about the documents?" he asked quietly. I folded my hands over the journal and looked at him steadily. "Yes," I said simply. Daniel exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carries both relief and the weight of responsibility. We stood together in silence, the living room around us filled with shadows, memories, and the quiet hum of the heating system. I allowed him space to gather his thoughts while I considered my next steps. Observation was still my greatest tool. Vanessa had made her move, but she had underestimated the depth of awareness within the household, the careful attention of someone who had built and maintained every detail of the life around her. We moved through the house together without speaking for a few minutes, noting the subtle signs Vanessa had left in her wake, the minor shifts in arrangement, the small, seemingly innocuous decisions that altered the rhythm of daily life. Each one revealed intent, strategy, and the need for a calculated response. Daniel finally spoke again. "I do not want to sell the house, Mom," he said, his words tentative but firm. I kept my expression neutral, allowing the statement to stand as a seed of understanding. "It is more than walls and furniture," I replied softly. "It is where our family history lives." Outside, the wind picked up slightly, rustling the branches against the window pane. I could feel the tension in the house ebb and flow like the weather outside. The evening progressed quietly, Emily's presence in our conversation lingering as an invisible support, a reminder that awareness and action could be measured, deliberate, and effective. By the time the house grew darker with the approaching night, I had traced the outlines of a plan, a series of steps to preserve the integrity of our home, protect our family's legacy, and ensure that every move was deliberate, precise, and grounded in patience and observation. Vanessa believed she held control, but patience and insight are stronger than the illusion of power, and in the quiet of the study, I felt the steady, unshakable certainty that the next days would reveal the truth, and with it, the rightful order would be restored. 3 days later, the first snowfall of the season arrived quietly during the early morning hours, covering the front lawn in a thin blanket of white. I stood near the dining room window holding a warm cup of coffee, watching delicate snowflakes drift through the pale gray sky. The house looked peaceful from the outside, calm, untouched, but inside, tension lingered beneath every conversation, every glance, every carefully chosen word. Vanessa had become unusually attentive over the past few days. She complimented my cooking during dinner. She offered to organize the pantry. She even brought fresh flowers home from the grocery store and placed them in the kitchen beside the sink. To anyone else, her behavior might have appeared thoughtful, but kindness that arrives suddenly often carries purpose behind it. I noticed the way her eyes studied me when she thought I was distracted, the way she watched Daniel carefully whenever he spoke to me alone. She sensed something shifting. She simply did not know what. That afternoon, Daniel asked if we could talk privately in the study. The moment he closed the door behind him, I saw the exhaustion on his face more clearly than ever before. His shoulders looked heavier. Somehow, as if he had spent weeks carrying a burden he no longer knew how to manage. He sat slowly across from me near Richard's old desk and rubbed his hands together nervously. "Mom," he began quietly, "there are things I should have handled differently." I remained silent, allowing him space to continue. Outside the window, snow drifted softly against the bare branches while the grandfather clock downstairs echoed faintly through the hallway. "Vanessa has been pushing hard to move forward with the house," he admitted carefully. "At first, I thought she was just trying to help us prepare financially after Dad passed away." His voice cracked slightly on the word Dad. I looked down briefly at Richard's fountain pen resting neatly beside the desk lamp. "And now?" I asked gently. Daniel stared at the floor for several seconds before answering. "Now I think she planned this long before the funeral." The room fell completely still after that sentence. Not dramatic, not explosive, just quiet in the way truth often is when it finally arrives. I folded my hands calmly in my lap. "What changed your mind?" He exhaled heavily. "I found emails." My eyes lifted toward him slowly. Emails between Vanessa and the realtor. They started months ago. There it was again. Confirmation. Another piece falling into place exactly where I already suspected it belonged. Daniel swallowed hard before continuing. "She told them the house would be available by spring. She already discussed renovations and listing prices." His face tightened with shame. I did not know she had gone that far. I studied my son carefully then. The sadness in his expression felt genuine. So did the guilt. He looked less like a grown man in that moment, and more like the little boy who once hid broken report cards in his backpack because he was afraid of disappointing us. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked softly. Daniel looked toward the window, unable to meet my eyes immediately. "Because Emily was right." His voice dropped lower. "This house does not feel safe anymore." The same word I had used days earlier. Safe. Richard always believed a home should protect the people inside it, not quietly push them aside. Daniel rubbed his forehead again before speaking. "I confronted Vanessa this morning. My heartbeat remained steady, though my chest tightened slightly." "How did she respond?" He laughed once, bitterly and quietly. "She said I was being emotional because of grief." Emotional. Another harmless word twisted into something dismissive. Then she accused Emily of trying to turn me against her. I said nothing. Sometimes silence reveals more than questions ever could. Daniel leaned forward slowly, resting his elbows on his knees. "Mom, I think I made a terrible mistake by ignoring what was happening." I looked around the study then. At the shelves Richard built by hand 30 years ago. At the framed photographs from vacations and anniversaries. At the old leather chair near the fireplace where he used to fall asleep reading history books every winter evening. This room held too much life to become someone else's investment project. "People reveal themselves eventually," I said quietly. "Sometimes grief simply speeds up the process." Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes glassy with regret. Downstairs, I heard the front door open sharply. Vanessa's heels clicked rapidly across the hardwood floor before stopping near the kitchen. The tension in the house shifted instantly. Daniel straightened in his seat. Fear crossed his face for only a second, but I noticed it. "She cannot know we talked yet," he whispered carefully. "Yet." Interesting word, because it implied something inevitable was coming. I stood calmly and walked toward the study door. "Daniel," I said softly before opening it. He looked up immediately. "Your father once told me something during our first year of marriage." I rested my hand gently against the doorknob. A person can lie with words for years, but eventually, their actions begin speaking louder. Downstairs, Vanessa called his name from the kitchen, her voice tight and impatient beneath the forced sweetness. I glanced back at my son one final time before stepping into the hallway. "And once actions start speaking," I said quietly, "people finally hear the truth." By the following morning, the house had grown still in a way that felt purposeful rather than quiet. I stood in the kitchen with a steaming mug of Earl Grey, listening to the subtle hum of the heating system and the faint creak of the floorboards as Daniel moved about upstairs. Snow continued to drift lightly outside, settling over the walkway and garden, transforming the familiar surroundings into something that seemed both beautiful and foreign. I thought of Emily's words from days before, the warnings and quiet concern, and allowed myself to feel gratitude for her presence in the midst of confusion. There is power in awareness, I reminded myself, and it is often in the unexpected allies that clarity emerges. Downstairs, Vanessa busied herself arranging the breakfast table, the clatter of plates and cutlery punctuating the early morning calm. She glanced toward the living room where I stood by the window, offering a practiced smile. I returned it with the faintest tilt of my lips, calm, steady, unflinching. Daniel came down shortly after, rubbing his eyes, the quiet tension of yesterday still lingering in his posture. He avoided Vanessa's gaze momentarily, perhaps uncertain about how much she knew or how aware I was of the recent conversations and discoveries. I poured another cup of tea and joined him at the table, careful to maintain a neutral expression. The air between us carried a heavy weight, one that had grown over weeks of subtle manipulation and unnoticed moments. I recalled how Vanessa had orchestrated small adjustments in the house, little changes that collectively demonstrated her control, yet each of these gestures now appeared to me in their true form, revealing intent and strategy. Daniel sighed and picked at the toast on his plate without looking up. "Mom," he said finally, his voice low. I did not realize how much I had been influenced. I nodded slowly, acknowledging the weight of the admission without interrupting, allowing the quiet understanding to settle between us. Outside, the sunlight filtered weakly through clouds, casting a gentle illumination over the snow, each flake reflecting the faint glow as if reminding me that clarity often comes gradually, subtly, and without immediate recognition. I thought of the years I had spent building this home, cultivating warmth, care, and family tradition. Each step I had taken, each moment of patience, each decision made for love and preservation had created the foundation that Vanessa now sought to redirect. Yet patience and observation had become my allies, revealing every subtle misstep, every intentional deception. Daniel lifted his head and met my gaze. "I will not let her manipulate the decisions anymore," he said quietly. The words were careful, yet firm, imbued with an honesty that had been absent for far too long. I reached out and placed my hand over his, a simple gesture that carried reassurance and shared understanding. "Good," I said softly. "It is time we approach this with clarity and purpose. Carefully, deliberately, with attention to the details that truly matter." He nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly, though the weight of realization remained. Vanessa, hearing the quiet exchange, glanced toward us from the counter, her smile faltering for just a fraction of a second. It was a subtle signal, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable to the patient observer. The day continued, ordinary in its motions, yet the undercurrent had shifted. The balance of awareness had begun to tilt, revealing not the chaos Vanessa had intended to maintain, but the careful and steady resolve of someone who had lived a lifetime understanding both people and place. By mid-morning, the snow outside had softened the world, muted sounds, and brought a calm clarity to the house. I moved from the kitchen to the study, the room filled with objects, photographs, and memories that anchored me in both past and present. I organized papers quietly, making mental notes of actions that would need attention, decisions that required careful timing, and steps that would preserve the integrity of the home and family legacy. Each movement was deliberate, measured, and full of quiet power. Outside, the wind stirred the branches against the windows again, but I remained steady, aware that the truth had begun to speak for itself, and that with patience, clarity, and careful action, the rightful order of the family would reassert itself. The house, once subtly shifting under external influence, now felt steadier, more balanced, and I could sense the alignment of intention and awareness settling into place as the morning light brightened, reflecting off the snow and into the spaces where memory, loyalty, and careful observation coexisted with resolve.